Imagine, if you will, a relic of such profound historical significance that it remains encased in glass, protected by the heavy stone walls of a medieval bell tower in the heart of northern Italy. This is not the splintered wood of the true cross, nor is it the preserved knucklebone of a venerated martyr. It is not a crown worn by a Holy Roman Emperor, nor a scepter held by a long-dead duke. Instead, if you climb the steep, echoing stairs of the Torre della Ghirlandina in Modena, you will find something far more mundane, yet far more revealing of the human condition: a bucket. It is a simple object, fashioned from seasoned staves of local oak, held together by hand-forged iron hoops that have long since been kissed by the orange bloom of oxidation. To a modern observer, it is an item of zero intrinsic value, the kind of thing one might find rotting in the corner of an abandoned barn. But in the year 1325, this specific vessel of water and wood became the focal point of a geopolitical catastrophe that would claim the lives of thousands. This is the story of the War of the Oaken Bucket, a conflict that serves as a masterclass in how pride, petty localism, and the sprawling, incomprehensible mess of medieval politics can turn a household chore into a bloodbath. To understand why a bucket could lead to a massacre, we must first descend into the dense, suffocating fog of 14th century Italian politics. This was not the unified Italy of today, with its high-speed rail and standardized language. In 1325, the Italian peninsula was a fractured mosaic of city-states, each a sovereign universe unto itself, governed by ancient grudges and complex alliances. The overarching conflict of the era was the struggle between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. On the surface, this was a contest for supreme authority over Christian Europe. The Guelphs supported the temporal and spiritual authority of the Pope in Rome, while the Ghibellines threw their lot in with the Holy Roman Emperor, a Germanic ruler who claimed the mantle of the Caesars. But beneath this grand ideological veneer lay something far more visceral and far more boring: local competition over trade routes, grazing rights, and the simple human desire to see one's neighbor humbled in the dirt. Bologna was a Guelph stronghold. It was a city of learning, home to the oldest university in the Western world, a place where legal scholars spent their days debating the finer points of Justinian's code, while the sun beat down on the red-tiled roofs. It was a city that looked towards Rome for its legitimacy, a bastion of the papacy. Just a few dozen miles to the west sat Modena, a Ghibelline bastion. Modena was a city of warriors and stonemasons, a place that looked north towards the Alps, awaiting the arrival of an emperor who rarely came, but whose name provided a convenient excuse to ignore the dictates of the Vatican. Between these two cities stretched the fertile plains of the Po Valley, a landscape of wheat fields, drainage ditches, and small fortified outposts that changed hands with the frequency of a summer breeze. The tension between Bologna and Modena was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing simmer that had lasted for over 2 centuries. Every generation added its own layer of resentment. There were disputes over the exact placement of boundary stones in the muddy fields near the river Panaro. There were arguments over the tolls charged to merchants hauling salt or silk from the coast. There were the insults shouted from the battlements, creative, multisyllabic Italian profanities that questioned the lineage and the hygiene of the opposing side. By the autumn of 1325, the air in the Po Valley was thick with the scent of impending violence. The harvest was in, the granaries were full, and the young men of both cities were bored. In the medieval world, boredom was a dangerous commodity. The specific geography of the border was a nightmare of jurisdictional overlap. Imagine a patchwork quilt where every square is owned by a different landlord, and every landlord has a different idea of where his property ends and the next man's begins. The border between the Modenese and the Bolognese territories was dotted with castelli, small fortified villages that functioned as early warning systems. These were not the romantic castles of fairy tales. They were damp, cramped stone boxes where a dozen soldiers spent their days playing dice and watching the horizon for dust clouds. The most significant of these was the fortress of Montevideo. For years, Montevideo had been a Bolognese possession, a vital shield against Modenese incursions. But in early 1325, the fortress had defected to Modena, or rather it had been seized by Ghibelline sympathizers from within. To the leaders in Bologna, this was not just a territorial loss, it was a personal affront to their dignity and their legal standing in the eyes of the Pope. The summer months of 1325 were characterized what historians call petite guerre, the Little War. It consisted of cattle raiding, the burning of haystacks, and the occasional kidnapping of a minor official for ransom. It was a war of nerves, designed to exhaust the enemy's treasury and patience. The Bolognese, wealthier and more numerous, felt they could afford to wait. The Modenese, leaner and more aggressive, knew they had to strike a blow that would resonate. They needed to do something that would pierce the Bolognese sense of superiority. They needed an act of symbolic defiance. On a moonless night in late October, a small group of Modenese soldiers, some accounts say as few as 12, others suggest a larger raiding party of 50, crept towards the Bologna gate known as the Porta San Felice. This gate was a vital artery for the city, a point of pride and a hub of commerce. The guards, perhaps lulled into a false sense of security by the routine of the long-standing stalemate, were likely preoccupied or perhaps even asleep in the guardhouse. The Modenese didn't intend to sack the city. They didn't have the numbers for a siege. They simply wanted to cause trouble. They slipped through the shadows, avoiding the pools of light cast by the flickering torches of the city watch. They reached a public well located just inside the city walls. This well was a communal resource, a place where the women of the district gathered every morning to exchange gossip while filling their buckets. It was a symbol of the city's domestic stability and its ability to provide for its citizens. One of the Modenese soldiers, in a moment of inspired pettiness, noticed a wooden bucket sitting on the edge of the stone well frame. It was a heavy thing, dripping with cold groundwater. He grabbed it. His companions likely laughed, a hushed, jagged sound in the dark. They didn't steal the city's gold. They didn't burn down the granary. They took the bucket. They retreated as quickly as they had arrived, disappearing back into the darkness of the countryside, the wooden bucket swinging from a soldier's saddle, its rhythmic thumping against the horse's flank marking the cadence of their escape. When the sun rose over the red towers of Bologna the next morning, the theft was discovered. In any other context, a missing bucket would be a matter for a low-level magistrate, or perhaps a simple shrug of the shoulders. But in the hypercharged atmosphere of 1325, the missing bucket became casus belli. To the Bolognese, the bucket was no longer just a tool for drawing water. It was a piece of the city itself. Its presence in Modena was a physical manifestation of the Ghibelline insult. It was a taunt, a trophy, and a deep, stinging wound to their collective honor. They demanded its immediate return. The Modenese, sensing they had finally found the perfect way to irritate their rivals, refused. They didn't just refuse, they hung the bucket in the center of their own city for all to see. They turned a common household object into a monument of Bolognese incompetence. The fuse was lit, and the resulting explosion would change the history of the region forever.
The refusal of the Modenese was not merely a diplomatic rejection, it was a meticulously choreographed performance of defiance. In the 14th century, honor was not a nebulous or abstract concept. It was a tangible currency that could be devalued by a single moment of perceived weakness. To allow a common bucket, a vessel of wood and iron used for the most mundane of chores, to remain in the hands of the Ghibelline rivals was to admit that the city of Bologna was subservient to the will of the Holy Roman Emperor's local sycophants. The Bolognese City Council met under the heavy, oppressive shadow of the two towers, their voices echoing through the vaulted, cold chambers of the Palazzo di Curcio. They did not debate the literal value of the bucket, nor did they discuss the cost of replacing the timber or the iron hoops. They debated the survival of the Guelph identity itself. In their eyes, the bucket had been transformed. It was no longer a tool for water. It had become a holy relic of their own indignation. Pope John XXII, reigning from the distant and comparatively serene enclave of Avignon, saw in this local spat a golden opportunity to tighten his waning grip on the unruly Italian territories. To the papacy, the missing bucket was a convenient and timely pretext. If the Guelphs of Bologna could successfully crush the Ghibellines of Modena, it would signal a decisive victory for the Church's temporal power over the imperial influence of Ludwig the Bavarian. This was no longer a petty squabble over a kitchen utensil. It was a proxy battle in the eternal, grinding struggle between the mitre and the crown. The call to arms went out to the surrounding Guelph allies with a fervor usually reserved for crusades. Florence, always eager for an excuse to strike at an imperial stronghold and expand its own Tuscan influence, sent a contingent of seasoned men. Smaller communes, desperate to curry favor with the Holy See and avoid the wrath of the local legates, sent their meager, terrified militias. By late autumn of 1325, the dust on the Via Emilia was thick and choking, kicked up by the rhythmic thud of thousands of boots. The scale of the mobilization was, by any rational military standard, utterly preposterous. Historical records, though often prone to medieval exaggeration, suggest that Bologna and its allies managed to muster an incredible force of roughly 30,000 infantry and 2,000 heavily armored cavalry. To put that in perspective, the total population of Modena at the time was significantly smaller than the size of the army currently marching towards its gates to destroy it. It was a massive sledgehammer being brought to bear against a single stubborn walnut. Yet the walnut was fortified, led by men who knew that a siege was a game of patience rather than numbers, and they were deeply, perhaps dangerously, amused by the entire situation. The preparation for this war was rarely about the glory of the charge. It was about the dull, repetitive drudgery of the forge and the granary. In the weeks following the formal declaration, the relentless clatter of hammers against anvils became the permanent heartbeat of Bologna. Every blacksmith in the city was conscripted to repair breastplates that had gathered rust in damp storage since the last minor skirmish years prior. They sharpened spearheads that had, in times of peace, been used to prop up cellar doors or stir large vats of dye. There is a certain irony in the fact that the very metal used to reinforce the stolen bucket was now being mirrored in the thousands of blades being honed for its recovery. The cost of this mobilization was staggering, draining the city coffers to pay for mercenary captains who cared little for the bucket, but deeply for the gold florins promised to them. The logistics of feeding 32,000 men on the move meant that the autumn harvest was essentially seized in its entirety, leaving the local peasantry to wonder if the bucket was worth the winter famine that would surely follow. The first strategic objective for the Bolognese high command was not the city of Modena itself, but the surrounding defensive network that shielded the Ghibelline capital. The podesta, the chief magistrate and military leader of Bologna, understood that a direct assault on a fortified city was a recipe for a long, expensive disaster. Instead, they moved to isolate the enemy by targeting the castle of Montevideo. This fortress sat like a stone sentinel on the jagged hills overlooking the fertile plains, acting as a strategic linchpin. If Montevideo fell, Modena would be effectively blinded, its supply lines severed and its northern flank exposed. The siege began with the typical agonizing medieval lethargy. Massive catapults were assembled on site, their wooden frames groaning and creaking under the immense tension of twisted animal sinew and heavy rope. Great stones were hauled from nearby riverbeds to be used as projectiles, crashing against the castle walls with a thunderous impact that could be heard for miles. For the soldiers in the muddy trenches, the war was not a grand crusade for a stolen prize. It was a cold, damp reality of digging, waiting, and dying of dysentery. While Bologna moved its massive weight, the Lord of Modena, Passerino Bonacolsi, watched from his battlements with a calculating eye. Bonacolsi was not a man prone to panic. He was a seasoned Ghibelline commander who understood that morale was often more potent than raw numbers. He knew that the larger an army grew, the more difficult it became to manage. 32,000 men required an impossible amount of clean water and bread. 32,000 men produced a mountain of waste and a valley of discontent. He kept the stolen bucket prominently displayed, a constant visual reminder to his own citizens of why they were fighting, and a constant taunt to the scouts who watched from the distant hills. He did not seek to meet the Bolognese in a traditional open field of battle immediately. Instead, he allowed them to tire themselves against the walls of Montevideo, waiting for the moment when the sheer gravity of their own numbers would begin to work against them. The geography of the Emilia-Romagna region played its own silent role in the escalating conflict. The Panaro River, a winding and temperamental waterway, served as a natural barrier that both sides had to navigate with extreme caution. As the Bolognese army maneuvered, they were forced to contend with the softening ground of November, which turned the heavy movement of cavalry into a slow, sucking quagmire. The sacred Carroccio, the massive four-wheeled war wagon that carried the city's standard and a portable altar, was a nightmare to transport through the mud. Yet it had to be protected at all costs, for its capture would mean a spiritual and political defeat far greater than the loss of 10 buckets. The wagon, draped in the bold red and white colors of Bologna, was pulled by teams of oxen, their progress measured in agonizing inches as the army crawled towards the inevitable confrontation. By the time the Bolognese forces reached the vicinity of Zappolino, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the palpable tension of two ideologies about to collide. The Ghibellines had finally moved, slipping from behind their walls to take up positions that utilized the broken terrain to neutralize the Guelph numerical advantage. The sun began to set on the evening of November 15th, casting long, distorted shadows across the valley floor. The two armies stood facing each other, a sea of steel and colorful heraldry that seemed entirely disproportionate to the humble object that had brought them there. Thousands of men, who only months ago had been tending vines or selling cloth, now clutched pikes and shields, staring across the gap at neighbors and cousins who happened to support a different claimant to a distant throne. As the first frost of the night began to settle on the grass, the quiet was broken only by the occasional neighing of a horse or the clank of a guard's poleaxe. The fuse that had been lit in a dark well in Bologna had finally reached the powder keg. The Battle of Zappolino was no longer a threat. It was a certainty. And as the commanders looked over their maps one last time, the bucket sat silent in Modena, a wooden witness to the impending carnage.
The first movement was not a roar, but a rhythmic, metallic clatter that echoed off the surrounding hills of the Val Samaggia. It began as a ripple through the Ghibelline lines, the smaller but more disciplined force of Modena and its allies.
Passerino Bonacolsi, a man whose name sounds more like a delicate pastry than a ruthless military commander, knew that his 7,000 men were essentially standing in a very large, very dangerous shadow. The 32,000 Bolognese Guelphs across the field were not just an army, they were a demographic anomaly. In the logic of the 14th century, a numerical advantage of nearly 5 to 1 should have been the end of the conversation. But as the last sliver of the sun dipped behind the Apennines, the conversation was only just beginning, and it was being conducted in the language of sharpened iron and heavy oak. The Bolognese, led by Malatestino dell'Occhio, a name that translates to Little Malatesta of the Eye, which is arguably the most intimidating thing about him, had positioned themselves with a sense of entitlement that only a massive numerical surplus can provide. They expected a traditional engagement, a slow, ponderous march, a clash of shields, and an eventual Ghibelline retreat fueled by the sheer exhaustion of killing so many people. However, the Modenese had no intention of participating in a traditional engagement. They were fighting for their city, their political survival, and, depending on which disgruntled tavern dweller you asked, the honor of a piece of municipal property that was currently sitting in a cellar miles away. The battle commenced around 2 hours before total darkness. This was a tactical choice that most historians would call highly questionable, but for the Ghibellines it was a necessity. In the failing light, 30,000 men look like 60,000, but more importantly, 30,000 panicked men look like a disaster. The Modenese vanguard, composed of heavy cavalry and seasoned German mercenaries who were paid specifically to ignore the odds, struck the Bolognese flank with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, if that scalpel weighed half a ton and was moving at a full gallop. The initial impact was, in a word, messy. The Bolognese infantry, many of whom were local tradesmen who had spent the previous week arguing about the price of grain rather than practicing pike formations, found themselves suddenly very aware of the limitations of their gambesons. A gambeson, for those of you who don't spend your weekends at medieval reenactments, is essentially a very thick quilted jacket. It is excellent for staying warm during a brisk Italian autumn. It is significantly less excellent at stopping a lance propelled by a charging destrier. The Guelph line, which had looked so formidable from a distance, began to buckle not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked space. They were so tightly packed that when the front rank tried to brace for the impact, the second rank tripped over them, and the third rank simply looked around in confusion, wondering why the people in front were suddenly much shorter. As the Ghibelline cavalry drove deeper into the mass of men, the geographical reality of Zappolino began to play its part. The terrain was uneven, a series of rolling slopes and hidden dips that turned the battlefield into a giant muddy obstacle course. To the Bolognese, the darkness was an enemy. They couldn't see how few Modenese were actually attacking them. To the Modenese, the darkness was a shroud, hiding their vulnerability and magnifying their aggression. Passerino's forces moved with a terrifying synchronization, the product of a unified command structure that the fractured Bolognese leadership could only dream of. While Malatestino was likely shouting orders that were being swallowed by the din of clashing steel, the Modenese were executing a series of pre-planned maneuvers that pushed the Guelph setter toward the river. By the time the moon began to rise, the Battle of Zappolino had transitioned from a military engagement into a high-stakes foot race. The Guelph line didn't just break, it evaporated. It is a peculiar phenomenon of medieval warfare that more men usually die during the retreat than during the actual fighting. When a soldier turns his back to the enemy, he ceases to be a combatant and becomes a target. The Modenese recognized this transition immediately. They didn't stop to celebrate their improbable success. They lowered their spears and began the pursuit. The retreat was a chaotic sprawl across the countryside. Thousands of Guelph soldiers discarded their heavy shields and cumbersome helmets, choosing the possibility of survival over the certainty of protection. They fled toward the safety of Bologna's walls, 12 miles to the northeast. But 12 miles is a long way to run when you are being chased by men on horseback who are very annoyed about a long-standing territorial dispute. The road to Bologna became a corridor of discarded heritage and abandoned pride. Amidst this chaos, the political gravity of the situation was shifting. This wasn't just about a bucket anymore, though the bucket remained the symbolic North Star of the conflict. This was about the total humiliation of the regional superpower. Bologna was the La Grassa, the fat city, a center of learning and wealth. Modena was the underdog, the scrappy Ghibelline outpost that refused to ignore the Pope's supremacy. As the Bologna survivors scrambled toward the city gates, they weren't just running from swords, they were running from the realization that their entire world order had been upended by a force a fraction of their size. The Modenese didn't stop at the outskirts. They followed the retreating Guelphs right up to the very gates of Bologna itself. In the flickering torchlight, the citizens of Bologna watched in horror as their grand army, the one that had marched out with such pomp and ceremony, returned as a shattered, breathless mob. The gates of San Felice, Santa Sia, and Della Lame were slammed shut, the iron bars dropping with a finality that signaled the end of the field campaign and the beginning of a panicked siege mentality. But the Modenese had no intention of conducting a long, drawn-out siege. They didn't have the supplies, the manpower, or frankly the patience. Instead, they decided to engage in a bit of 14th century psychological warfare. They set up camp outside the walls and began a series of celebrations that were essentially the medieval equivalent of a victory dance. They held polios or races right under the noses of the Bolognese defenders. They mocked the Guelphs from the safety of the dark fields, their laughter carrying over the ramparts. And then there was the matter of the bucket. While the primary bucket, the one snatched from the well earlier, was already safely tucked away in Modena, the Modenese soldiers decided that one bucket simply wasn't enough to convey the magnitude of their victory. According to some accounts, they stopped at a well just outside the city gates, the Well of San Felice, and took another one. Not because they needed it for water, but because they needed to prove that they could. They took it as a souvenir, a trophy of their audacity, and a physical manifestation of the fact that they had marched to the very doorstep of their enemy and found nobody brave enough to stop them. As the night deepened, the fires of the Modenese camp illuminated the surrounding plains. Inside the city, the Bolognese leadership sat in stunned silence. They had lost thousands of men, their military reputation was in tatters, and the enemy was literally playing games in their backyard. The War of the Oaken Bucket had reached its crescendo. The battle was won, the retreat was complete, and the humiliation was absolute. But as the Bolognese commanders looked at the towering walls of Bologna, they knew they couldn't stay forever. They had made their point. Now they just had to decide how to finish the story. Back in Modena, the original bucket sat in its quiet corner, oblivious to the fact that it had just become the most famous piece of kitchenware in human history. The night was cold, the grass was stained, and the map of Italy was about to be redrawn in the ink of an impossible victory.
But maps are static things. Ink dries and paper yellows. The reality on the ground that night was far more visceral. The Modenese did not reach for ladders or battering rams. They did not prepare the heavy timber of a siege. Instead, they reached for their pride and their sense of theater. Under the very noses of the defeated Bolognese, the victors decided that military dominance was not enough. They required a spectacle. In the flickering light of 1,000 campfires, the Modenese commanders organized 3 pali, traditional athletic races, outside the city gates. It was the ultimate medieval insult. While the cream of the Bolognese nobility hid behind their stone battlements, weeping for their fallen sons, the Modenese soldiers were running foot races, horse races, and even a race for cross-dressers, all to commemorate their triumph on the same soil where their enemy's blood was still soaking into the earth. When the Modenese finally turned their backs on the city walls, they did not leave empty-handed. Tradition tells us that it was during this post-battle taunting that a group of soldiers, perhaps driven by thirst or perhaps by a sudden flash of inspired petty theft, spotted a simple oaken bucket at a public well just outside the San Felice gate. In the grand hierarchy of war trophies, a bucket ranks somewhere below a captured banner and slightly above a handful of gravel. Yet, in the logic of the 14th century, it was perfect. It was a mundane piece of property belonging to the commune of Bologna, and taking it was a way of saying that the Bolognese could not even protect their own water supply. They hoisted the bucket, sturdy, water-stained, and bound with iron hoops, and carried it back to Modena with more reverence than if it had been the Holy Grail itself. The journey back to Modena was a victory parade that stretched for miles. The bucket was not hidden away, it was displayed. When they reached the city gates, the population erupted. For a city that had lived in the shadow of its larger, wealthier neighbor for centuries, this was the moment the scales finally tipped. But the war, as all wars must, eventually ran into the dry, dusty world of diplomacy. In January 1326, the Peace of Alice was signed. On paper, it seemed as though the blood spilled at Zappolino had bought very little. The Pope, John XXII, acting as a mediator from his seat in Avignon, pushed for a return to the status quo. Bologna regained some of its lost territory, and Modena agreed to stop its immediate incursions. To a distant observer, it looked like a draw, but the Bolognese knew better. They had lost their dignity, and they had lost their bucket. The Modenese refused to return the vessel, placing it instead in the basement of the Torre della Ghirlandina, the city's great bell tower, as a permanent reminder of the day they broke the pride of the learned city. For nearly 3 centuries, the bucket remained a local curiosity, a piece of municipal trivia known to the citizens of Modena, but forgotten by the wider world. That changed in the early 17th century with the arrival of Alessandro Tassoni. Tassoni was a man of the High Renaissance, a wit and a writer, who saw in the absurdities of the Middle Ages a perfect target for satire. In 1622, he published La Secchia Rapita, or The Rape of the Bucket. It was the world's first mock heroic poem, a literary masterpiece that took the triviality of a stolen kitchen utensil and elevated it to the level of Homeric epic, changing the bucket's destiny. Tassoni's verses populated the conflict with bumbling gods, vainglorious knights, and exaggerated battles, turning the very real tragedy of Zappolino into a comedic sauce that echoed across Europe. He realized what the historians often miss, that human history is not just a series of grand movements and noble ideals, but a comedy of errors, fueled by spite and small-mindedness. The poem became a sensation, and the bucket was transformed from a piece of stolen communal property into a legendary relic of Italian culture. Today, the bucket still exists, though the passage of 700 years has necessitated a certain level of preservation. If you visit Modena today, you can find a replica hanging in the Torre della Ghirlandina, precisely where the original hung for centuries. The real bucket, or at least the one that the city's records swear is the original, is kept safely inside the Palazzo Comunale, behind protective museum glass. It sits there,
a humble assembly of wooden staves and rusted iron that looks remarkably like any other bucket you might find in a medieval farmhouse. There is something deeply boring about it in its physicality. It does not glow, it does not hum with ancient power. It is just a bucket. But in the quiet air of the museum, it carries the weight of 2,000 ghosts from the fields of Zappolino. It represents the moment when a border dispute became a legend, and when a simple household item became the focal point of a regional identity that persists to this day. The Bolognese, for their part, have never quite forgotten the slight. Even now, in the playful banter between the two cities, the bucket is mentioned as a point of contention, a lingering itch in the historical memory of the region. This simple wood object remains the most famous kitchen utensil in Italian history. As we look back at the War of the Oaken Bucket, we are forced to confront the strange machinery of human conflict. We like to think that our wars are fought for grand causes, for liberty, for religion, or for the survival of the state. And while the Guelphs and Ghibellines certainly believe they were fighting for the future of the papacy and the empire, the history books remember the bucket. It is a reminder that the causes of war are often far less important than the stories we tell about them afterward. The 1325 conflict was a brutal encounter between two neighboring cities that shared a language, a religion, and a landscape. It was a tragedy of proximity. Yet by focusing on the bucket, history has found a way to sanitize the violence, turning a day of slaughter into a quirky anecdote for tourists and schoolchildren. It is the ultimate triumph of the mundane over the monumental. In the end, the map of Italy was indeed redrawn, but not by the hands of kings or emperors. It was redrawn by the persistence of local pride. Modena remained defiant, Bologna remained resilient, and the bucket remained stolen. As the sun sets over the plains of Emilia-Romagna, casting long shadows from the Ghirlandina across the rooftops of Modena, one can almost hear the phantom echoes. The cheers of the soldiers have faded, the heavy iron armor has rusted away. The names of the men who died at Zappolino are mostly lost to the damp, forgotten archives. But the bucket persists. It stands as a silent witness to the fact that humans will fight for anything, and once they have fought, they will cling to symbols. History is a grand tapestry of progress, but stories like this suggest it is actually a collection of small, stubborn, immovable things. A disputed well, a stolen bucket, or a petty personal insult. These things refuse to be forgotten because they represent the very core of our humanity. It is in these boring, everyday objects that the true character of our ancestors is revealed. They were people who got angry over buckets and found meaning in the most unlikely places. Thank you for joining us for this exploration of history's most peculiar and pointless regional conflict. The story is told, but the vessel stays where it belongs, in the city that won. It remains a small wooden vessel holding a vast and messy story. This simple oaken bucket is history, and history is quite often surprisingly and wonderfully boring.